Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran. This video is going to be very unscripted, but a lot of you guys have asked me to make a video to talk a bit about Roll the Bones and proper ways of using it. This video is going to talk about Roll the Bones in terms of PvE as well as PvP. I just want to talk about the use, when to reroll, when not to reroll, the alternatives to it, as well as some of the trades that might fit with it. Anyway, let's get into the video with PvE aspect of Roll the Bones. Let's talk about dungeons and raids. So this is going to be the talent build that you're going to end up running for dungeons and raids. For the most part, there's only one change with Dance Steel for pure AoE, maybe hit and run, but this is probably the best build so far for dungeons and raids. In Mythic Pluses, in raids, that's probably what you'll end up running as Outlaw. So how does the Roll the Bones mechanic work in PvE? It's very simple set of rules. So in the opener, of course, you're gonna go. What I like to do is this is not really part of the video, but ambush, vanish, ambush, so you can get most of my common points. I get my blade rush in there, and you re-roll. Now, with Outlaw, you keep building common points and keep re-rolling your buffs until you get the right buffs. Grand Melee is a great buff since a lot of our damage is simply auto attacks. A huge portion of Outlaw Rogue damage is just straight up auto attack damage. And Blizzard decided to buff the damage of auto attacks for a lot of melee classes, but for Outlaw in particular, us swinging heavy weapons means that a good chunk of that basic rotation is just, no matter how many Sinister Strikes and Dispatches I use, a lot of it is going to be melee. So, Grand Melee is going to be one of those buffs you keep, and when you're about, well, normally you want to reroll buffs at about 10 seconds, so you can have the pandemic effect. That means 10 seconds of the buff that you have is going to roll into the 36 seconds of the next buff. So let's say you had a good buff and you roll in 10 extra seconds into another good buff, that means you get value. If you roll into a bad buff, you just keep rolling until that value eventually connects. Once that buff runs out, or at least as 10 seconds, you want to re-roll after you build common points. This is another combination of buffs you keep. Any 2 buff. I don't care what it is, any 2 buff is a good buff. It's a damage increase in one way or another, whether it is True Bearing, which is not as strong as it used to be. Thank God, actually, the True Bearing is not as strong as it used to be. Because in Legion, it was like, you either got True Bearing or you got nothing. And now, they changed the way they changed Outlaw Rogue for BFA, where you have a lot more consistent damage from your Sinister Strikes, your Dispatches, your auto attacks. Like, you have reliable damage no matter what you do. Alright, so my buffs are about to expire, and of course I want to reroll again. This is a 1 buff for Skull and Crossbones. Used to be called Jala Raja. This one you don't want to keep. So you're going to want to build up common points and reroll. Hey, you got buffs that you want to keep, but let's say it's a bad buff, alright? Let's reroll. Hey, Skull and Crossbones again. It is worth rerolling. Let's say it's a bad buff too, because I'm trying to illustrate another buff. Shark Infested Waters, or at least that's what they used to be the name for it. Now called Ruthless Precision. You keep this buff and you try to use Between the Eyes as often as possible. And that's it. So you either have Grand Melee, which is your auto attack buff. You have your Shark buff, which is pretty easy to remember. That's not the name of it. It's called Ruthless Precision, but you can just refer yourself to Shark buff because it has the icon of a shark. So you get the Shark buff for crit, you have Grand Melee for auto attacks, and any 2 buff combination is what you end up using as an Outlaw. That's it. That's your basic playstyle for PvE. What they've done for Outlaw Rogues in BFA is they made them a lot more powerful standalone no matter what buff you end up running. No matter what buff you use, the spec itself deals good auto attack damage, has good damage for Sinister Strikes. Our pistol shot procs, especially with quick draw, are a lot more powerful. Dispatches do a lot of damage, and if we play up to our playstyle, like certain buffs, like the Shark buff, for example, giving us more chance to crit, allows us a lot more optimal output of damage, even when we don't have the best buff 24/7. So, because your damage of auto attacks, Sinister Strikes, Dispatches, and pistol shots is good, even if you have moments where you just have 1 buff and you have to reroll, you have 1 buff and you have to reroll, your damage shouldn't suffer too much. In the past, it used to be you either get a buff or you don't get buff. If you got a buff, you had damage. If you didn't get the right buff, you didn't have damage. Now Outlaw has slightly better damage when you have a buff, slightly worse but not by much when you don't have the right buff. So for Outlaw for PvE, in the long run, honestly, it is just worth rerolling until you have the right set of buffs. Once you have the right set of buffs, you want to maximize the use of that buff, like to its fullest. When you don't have the right buff, it is simply just worth to keep recycling it until you get the one you need. You should honestly learn how to play with the buff mechanic with Outlaw. It is strong. One of the fun of it is the fact that you get to adjust your playstyle. If you read Ruthless Precision, you got extra 60% critical strike for you between the eyes. So you have what, 19% plus 60%? That means you want to use between the eyes quite often. Sometimes you'll get lucky with the crits, sometimes you don't, but when you do get lucky with the crits, it's going to be good damage. Let's reroll. You got Buried Treasure. That one is not really anything that changes your gameplay that much. We already had this buff just now. Let's reroll out of it, see what we get. Grand Melee is another passive one. It's just a very strong buff. Skull and Crossbones makes you want to pay attention to your Sinister Strikes and your pistol shots, because you are way more likely to get a Sinister Strike proc for your free pistol shot. So you're trying to make sure to maximize your common point generation and common point effectiveness. Very slight change, but it kind of adjusts your playstyle ever so slightly, so you don't always have like a very predictable rotation. We got the Shark buff again. Let's see what we can go for. The Skull and Crossbones again, used to be called Jolly Roger. I don't know why they changed some of the names for here. The one I'm looking for is Broadside. I'm not getting anything for Broadside, am I? That's a yikes. Broadside? Not quite yet. Oh wait, we did get a Broadside. So Broadside means you generate a lot more common points. That means our free procs for pistol shot now generate 3 common points. So you know what you can decide as an Outlaw Rogue? You can either hit Sinister Strike, which has potential for its Sinister Strike to double up, so you wasted all those common points that you could have gotten. Or you could have just run through with a Dispatch at 4 common points to get the most value, so you're not really generating too many common points and overdrawing on that value kind of deal. So it adjusts your playstyle ever so slightly. And overall the playstyle ends up being a lot stronger. You will have downtime where you gotta reroll, but also the rerolls have a lot better chances in your favor. So you have a 1 in 5 chance to get 2 or more buffs. So 19% chance to get 2 buffs, 1% chance to get 1 buff, and then you have a fair amount of chance to get your Grand Melee or your Shark buff. So there's a lot more chances in your favor now in BFA compared to how it was in Legion, where it was really just True Bearing, 2 buff, or 5 buff combo, which just wasn't all that strong. So the spec itself does a lot more auto attack damage, does a lot more Sinister Strike damage, better run through damage, better between the eyes damage. So it has consistency and sustain no matter what buff you have. Now, alternatives to Outlaw and Roll the Bones. Let's say you decided you don't want to play Roll the Bones. For whatever reason you decided, even though the mechanic is not that difficult, and hopefully I was able to explain it as great detail as possible, it is not some kind of a crazy... I don't remember any World of Warcraft classes that have been so complicated, and even this one is by no means complicated. Let's say you decided you want to play way easier. You want to play Slice and Dice. Well, they changed it with Slice and Dice, and the problem with it is you're going to sim your character a little bit differently. Slice and Dice offers you a watered-down version of Grand Melee, so it's 50% auto attack speed, and a watered-down version of the buff for Buried Treasure, so it's 15% energy regen instead of like, what, 20% or so? By 4 energy a second extra? That was like 20% in the past. So you can opt in for this. You are losing alacrity, so it's a nice haze buff to you. You are going to get more consistency in your damage. You're not going to have to reroll for buffs at all. So you're thinking, okay, so I don't have to spend time rerolling. I can spend more time throwing in dispatches and throwing out between the eyes, yeah? Well, you're losing a lot of the potential with cooldown reduction, True Bearing, giving you cooldowns back faster. You're losing out the auto attack buff that's a little bit more potent than your Slice and Dice. You're losing out on the crit potential and the playstyle with Between the Eyes. You're losing on Broadsides. You're losing on your Skull and Crossbones. So you're losing also on kind of the fun playstyle for it. So let's just try the playstyle after all the changes here. Let's just get ourselves a Slice and Dice and just start going for cooldowns. So now you don't have any of the fun playstyles you would have had playing Outlaw, playing Roll the Bones. Not only does Slice and Dice not really deal nearly as much damage, it is, you know, right now I'm bursting, so I'm doing fair chunk, but not as much burst potential as what Roll the Bones can do. I'm also losing out on an alacrity, extra haste that I can get out of I guess, you know, playing with the buffs. And on top of it, I'm losing out on various different buffs that alter my playstyle to give me a little bit more oomphy, a little more bursty oomph to the whole spec. Technically, you can play Slice and Dice. You can start out with Slice and Dice, but eventually you will wanna, if you wanna play Outlaw seriously, you will wanna eventually transition into a Roll the Bones playstyle, because the bones are fairly easy to use. They're not nearly as punishing as they used to be. It just means you gotta reroll a couple times, but your damage is still gonna be there no matter what. And it's all about maximizing the damage once you get decent buffs. You don't even need the best buffs either. You have more buffs that play to your favor than buffs that play against you now. So it's a lot better to just learn how to play Roll the Bones. Take your time, just practice it on a training dummy. A lot of people don't do this anymore. They don't go to hit a training dummy anymore. They don't go just to practice the rotation, to adapt to different situations. With Outlaw, it's not a spec that you can really predict. You get a random buffs, you get 1 out of 6 buffs, or a 2 buff combo, or a 5 buff combo, and being able to adapt to those buffs on an instant, from being able to remember the actual icons and being able to remember what they do, instead of having to maybe always mouse over them, or if you have, let's say, add-ons that tell you exactly what's going on. You could do that too. I feel like it's a lot better just to roll the bones and learn how to play with it. So this is the real explanation that I have for the PvE side of Roll the Bones. Let's talk a bit about the PvP. That one is going to be a little bit faster. So the PvP side of Roll the Bones. This is the playstyle, this is the build that I've been running actually recently for PvP. It's really between Mark for Death or Vigor. We can start with Mark for Death in the opener. So the Outlaw Rogue playstyle for PvP. I would have to say the buffs don't really affect you nearly as much. Just having a set of buffs is nice. If you get a crit buff, you could go for damage. If you get yourself a broadside buff, you could go for a stun into a fat quick draw pistol shot for half off. That does a little more damage. But do you need one specific buff to make everything happen? No, you usually just need just a buff for PvP. Because of the way that Outlaw is set up in PvP, you mostly just want to focus on doing damage, auto-attacking enemies, auto-attacking targets, and combining Plunder Armor. You have abilities like Thick as Thieves, for example, to get a 10% extra. Control as King to give you a little bit extra Adrenaline Rush. Maybe in arenas you'll want to run Smoke Bomb or something like this. And then you're trying to focus on crowd control and just outputting as much damage as possible and lining up cooldowns together with your partner. Or maybe you're in Battlegrounds trying to line up cooldowns together with buds, or it's just the team that you're playing, or you're trying to 1v1 somebody. That's the buff mechanic doesn't play nearly as heavy of value as it does in PvE. In PvP, I don't think it's worth to just keep re-rolling until you get the right buff. Maybe in arenas, right? In arenas, you're trying to wait for diminishing returns, you're trying to get your cooldowns back, you're trying to kind of play for time, you're trying to stall the enemy. Then it's worth maybe, you know, just throwing in re-rolls, because you're not really going for damage right now. So maybe you'll get a nice buff that'll allow you to do more damage, so your setup will be a lot more powerful and a lot more impactful. But in like Battlegrounds, for example, all you need to do is just Mark for Death, roll. Whatever you get is whatever you get. If you are in need of another buff, you can re-roll when the buff is kind of running low. What do you get? Hey, I got a 5 buff. That's not gonna happen that often. Actually been happening to me pretty often. Hey, you got this one. This one you kind of want to roll out of. If you get True Bearing, this one is fine to roll out of. It's better just to get a buff that somehow amps your playstyle a little bit. Let's say you're in BGs and you get Skull and Crossbones. Not a terrible buff. If you're not going for damage, feel free to re-roll it. 5 buff again. It's rare, guys. It's really rare. I promise you. It's super rare. Not that rare on me, though. Grab Melee is a good one. It's not going to be a great you know, change in your playstyle. It just allows you more auto-attack swings. So just as long as you face an enemy and auto-attack enemy should be good. Let's see. Let's say we got a re-roll for whatever reason. Hey, we got a 2 buff. Hey, good. That's it. And for the most part in PvP, I just wouldn't worry too much about the buff that you have. Worry about building combo points, worry about crowd control, worry about other things. If you have room, like again in arenas when you're trying to get a setup, when you're trying to get a lineup, you have a little bit of downtime and you're expecting downtime, you're not going for damage, it's fine if you want to just fish for buffs. If you get good buffs, good. If you don't, you don't. But the buffs, again, in PvE, are not going to change the fact that you have Killing Spree that slams into your target. It's not going to change that you have auto attacks that are just obliterating the enemy, Sinister Strikes that are just tearing them apart, Dispatches that are doing a fair amount of damage, even between the eyes when they do crit, can just crit for 16k of their health. You have your Thick as Thieves, you have your Plunder Armor to just amp the damage on top of that. And if you want, you can go Ghostly Strike just to get the trifecta, like 30% damage increase, if you so wanted to. So, buffs can affect you, but I don't think this should dictate your life, at least in PvP. Just get a set of buffs, and then just focus on building combo points. Also, if you're somebody who does PvP as Outlaw, if you want to try it, you can also try it with Vigor. With Vigor, buffs become even less important, because then with Vigor you're going to notice with how low haste we have with our gear. Like, I have, what, about 30% haste? That's me trying to gear for as much haste as humanly possible. As you can see, if I have a gem slot or I can enchant, I am putting haste on it. I need to get better bracers for haste, but I'm trying to go for as much haste as possible. You will go with Vigor. I just open up with a cheap shot into Roll the Bones. Whatever buffs I get is whatever buffs I get. And you just start building combo points and trying to nuke the enemy down. And that's it. I feel like with Mark for Death, you can kind of allow yourself to fish for buffs a little bit more, because you can, you know, get the cooldown reduction for Mark for Death and you can get it back a little bit faster. But if you're running Vigor for PvP, don't worry too much about the buffs. Just the fact that, oh, buffs are about to run out, let me build combo points, refresh, cool, whatever buff I get is whatever buff I get. And then don't worry about it. You're just focusing on trying to do as much damage to the enemy. The buff is just to change your playstyle a little bit. Hey, I have the shark buff. Let me try to get a stun in there. Let me try to get a nice pistol shot in there. That's a good chunk of enemy's health that would just be gone just like that. So it's I feel like it's very, very simple. And a lot of people overthink the buff mechanic. It is very simple mechanic. And hopefully this video was able to give you guys a little bit of an idea what it's supposed to be like. I know a lot of you are unsure when you play with it. You have a little bit of that RNG to it, and you're not sure if, like, wow, am I supposed to get it's like, why is it so unpredictable? Am I supposed to be able to get random buffs? Am I supposed to just have to reroll over and over and over again? Trust me, the way that Outlaw Rogue is set up, it's worth, if you're in PvE, just to maximize the value with a really good set of buffs. Do you have to reroll? Not really. Hell, we can even talk about some of the different traits, and we really should, because you should be looking at traits right now for the character. Let's take a look at some of the traits that we have for Outlaw. None of these traits really help. This is kind of cool. Snake Eyes. For each combo point you roll into Roll the Bones, cause your next 5 Sinister Strike to deal additional damage. So you invest in combo points into a set of buffs, or re-rolling can give you Sinister Strike damage. It returns that damage that you would use into a roll. You're thinking probably like, oh, I could be using Dispatch to do damage, but I'm having to use it in a roll, which doesn't deal damage. You can kind of return some of that back into your Sinister Strikes, or at least a few hits. Let's see, some of the other ones. Storm of Steel is not really the one I'm looking for. I have a bunch of pieces of gear here. Oh, here's a good one. Paradise Lost. Take control of the Dice of Fate, granting yourself agility if you only provide one buff. You can actually combine this together with Slice and Dice Hack. And that could probably work pretty well, having one buff with Slice and Dice. So, because it actually will work, you'll think of it as a Roll the Bones. So you'll always have a guaranteed amount of agility every time, as long as you have Slice and Dice up. So that could technically work. Technically could work. But if you're somebody who hates having, you know, feel like you're losing out on damage, you could go and stack up a bunch of Paradise Lost. Although you shouldn't need to. The way Outlaw is set up, it should do enough damage whether you have the perfect buff or not. The average output of Outlaw at the end of the day is going to be, well, fairly high, because Outlaw is actually performing really well, as long as you have the gear for it, as long as you have some traits, maybe some trinkets, and weapons, as long as you have good, strong weapons. And that's really all about it. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video about Roll the Bones. Hopefully it gave you guys a little bit of an idea. I didn't really know how to structure this video, so I decided to go really off the cuff without a script, talking about Roll the Bones, because I don't really know. It just seems like such a simple mechanic, at least to me, because I've been playing it for so long. And I think a lot of people just have an issue with Roll the Bones because they overcomplicate it for themselves. They think that there's some kind of a trick they just haven't heard. Maybe there's something that they're missing. No, it's as clean as day. It's as plain as day. It's as plain as white bread, literally. Like, it's a buff mechanic. You just roll until you get right buffs. If you PvP, you don't really need to roll for buffs. Just roll for a set of buffs. If you have downtime, you're more than welcome to roll. Maybe you'll get something good that might say, hey, I get damage. But the spec, the way it's set up in BFA, it deals good damage with auto attacks, Sinister Strikes, and Dispatches, no matter what buff you have. The buffs enhance the damage, but it's not enough to take over whether you have damage with right buffs or whether you don't have damage with bad buffs. You're gonna have damage regardless. It's just going to be slightly better or slightly worse depending on what kind of buff you have. But you still have damage regardless, so it shouldn't be an excuse for you guys not to try Outlaw. So I'm hoping a lot more of you guys will try Outlaw. I'm going to be making a PvP guide for Outlaw very, very soon. Hopefully this video was helpful for you guys. I tried to be as detailed as possible in my explanation. Hopefully my examples showed you enough when it comes to figuring out how to play with Roll the Bones. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see all of you in the next one.